the mists of time, where crown and sword dance with destiny, there lived a woman whose name would echo through centuries like thunder across ancient stones. She was born when winter winds carried whispers of empire, when the very air hummed with the promise of kingdoms yet to rise and fall. Her story begins not with fanfare, but with the quiet strength of a child who would grow to challenge the foundations of medieval power itself. Here, in the gentle rhythm of history's most extraordinary tale, let her legacy unfold like moonlight across water, carrying you into dreams where courage wears a crown and determination reshapes the world. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours, in the year of our Lord 1102, when February's frost still clung to the bare branches of English oak trees. A daughter was born to the most powerful man in the realm. She came into this world possibly at Sutton Courtenay in Berkshire, though some say Winchester witnessed her first breath, as morning light filtered through castle windows and illuminated the face that would one day stare down emperors and kings. Her father was Henry I, youngest son of William the Conqueror, a man who had seized the English crown through cunning and steel. His hands, which had once held a sword against his own brothers, now cradled this small child with surprising tenderness. The infant's mother, Matilda of Scotland, bore the bloodline of ancient Saxon kings, her ancestry reaching back to Alfred the Great like golden threads woven through time. This union of Norman conquest and Saxon heritage had created something newer, legitimacy that neither dynasty could claim alone. They named her Matilda after her mother, though history would know her by many titles: Empress, Lady of the English, and to some simply Maud. But in those early days, she was merely a daughter born into a world where daughters were valuable primarily for the alliances their marriages could forge. Yet this child would prove that destiny often writes its own rules, regardless of the expectations placed upon small shoulders. The England of Matilda's birth was still raw from conquest. Barely 40 years had passed since Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings, his Anglo-Saxon kingdom crumbling beneath Norman cavalry. The conquest had created a new aristocracy, one that held lands on both sides of the English Channel, their loyalties divided between their English holdings and their Norman roots. These were men who spoke French in their halls, but ruled over English serfs, who built stone castles atop Saxon foundations, who married into English nobility while maintaining their continental connections. Henry I ruled this patchwork realm with iron discipline, unlike his flamboyant elder brother William Rufus, who had died under mysterious circumstances in the New Forest. Henry possessed a calculating mind that saw kingdoms as vast chessboards. He understood that England's future lay not in endless warfare but in careful diplomacy, strategic marriages, and the slow building of institutions that would outlive any single ruler. Young Matilda's earliest years were spent in this atmosphere of calculated power. The royal court moved constantly between castles and manor houses, a travelling government that brought the king's presence to every corner of his realm. She would have witnessed the daily business of monarchy, petitioners seeking justice, nobles offering counsel, merchants bringing news from distant lands, and always the quiet presence of scribes recording the endless details of governance. Her education began early, as befitted a daughter of royal blood, while her younger brother William Adelin learned the arts of war and statecraft expected of a future king. Matilda absorbed the more subtle lessons deemed appropriate for a princess. She learned to read Latin, the language of scholarship, and Diplomacy. She studied the intricate rules of court etiquette, understanding that every gesture, every word, every glance carried meaning in the delicate dance of medieval politics. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to observe. In a world where women's power was often indirect, exercised through influence rather than command, the ability to read people's motivations and desires was invaluable. Matilda watched her parents navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy, noting how her mother's Saxon heritage helped bridge the gap between Norman conquerors and English subjects, how her father's careful cultivation of church leaders secured spiritual legitimacy for his rule. The royal court of her childhood was a cosmopolitan place, drawing visitors from across Europe. German merchants brought news of the Holy Roman Empire's struggles with the Pope. French nobles arrived with tales of crusades and courtly romance. Scottish envoys, many of them her mother's relatives, maintained the delicate balance between English overlordship and Scottish independence. Through these encounters, young Matilda began to understand that England was not an isolated kingdom, but part of a vast web of relationships that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Mediterranean. Her uncle David, later King of Scotland, was a frequent presence at court. A man of learning and ambition, he would regale the young princess with stories of his travels, his plans for Scotland's future, and the complex genealogies that connected their family to royal houses across Europe. These conversations planted seeds in Matilda's mind, helping her understand that royal blood carried both privilege and responsibility, that being born to rule meant accepting a destiny larger than personal desire. Among the other young nobles at court was her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, one of King Henry's many illegitimate children. Despite the circumstances of his birth, Robert possessed a keen intelligence and unwavering loyalty that would make him one of his father's most trusted advisors. Matilda and Robert developed a relationship that would prove crucial in later years, their shared understanding of royal duty creating a bond that transcended the usual complications of royal bastardry. Another frequent companion was her cousin Stephen of Blois, son of her father's sister Adela. Stephen was everything a medieval knight should be: charming, brave, generous, and blessed with the kind of easy charisma that made him popular wherever he went. He and Matilda played together as children, their games often mimicking the serious business of adults' mock councils where she played queen to his king, pretend negotiations where they divided imaginary kingdoms between them. Neither could have guessed that these childhood games were preparing them for a real conflict that would tear England apart. Brian Fitzcount, another ward of the court, completed this circle of young nobles who would shape England's future. Brian possessed a romantic nature unusual among the pragmatic Norman aristocracy, a man who would later channel his ideals into unwavering service to Matilda's cause. Even as children, he seemed to understand that she was different from other princesses, possessed of a will and intelligence that set her apart from the usual expectations of noble daughters. As Matilda grew, her physical beauty became evident, though contemporary descriptions followed the convention of praising royal ladies regardless of their actual appearance. What mattered more than beauty was presence, and Matilda possessed this in abundance. She carried herself with the unconscious authority of someone born to command, her movements graceful but decisive, her gaze direct in an age when women were taught to lower their eyes. Those who met her, even as a child, sensed something formidable. In her character, the year 1108 brought significant changes to her life. Henry I departed for Normandy, leaving Matilda and her brother William in the care of Archbishop Anselm of Canterbury. Anselm was a scholar saint, a man whose gentle wisdom provided a counterbalance to the martial atmosphere of royal courts. Under his guidance, Matilda deepened her understanding of theology and philosophy, studies that would serve her well in later negotiations with church leaders. But even as she studied scripture and debated theological points with learned clerics, political storms were gathering that would reshape her destiny entirely. Across the Channel in Germany, a young king named Henry V was consolidating his power and looking for ways to strengthen his position against both papal authority and rebellious nobles. His envoys would soon arrive at the English court with a proposal that would change Matilda's life forever. The marriage negotiations that began in late 1108 represented more than a simple dynastic alliance. For Henry I, the prospect of his daughter becoming Holy Roman Empress offered unprecedented prestige for a dynasty that was still, in European terms, relatively new. The Norman conquest had made the English kings powerful, but power without legitimacy remained vulnerable. An imperial marriage would place the English royal house on equal footing with the greatest dynasties of Europe. For the German king, the match offered both financial advantages and strategic benefits. The proposed dowry of 10,000 marks would fund his expedition to Rome for imperial coronation, while an alliance with England would complicate any potential French interference in German affairs. The marriage would also demonstrate his ability to negotiate with major European powers as an equal, strengthening his position against domestic rivals. As these discussions proceeded through the winter of 1108 and into 1109, Matilda found herself at the center of negotiations that would determine not just her personal future but the relationship between kingdoms. At 7 years old, she was too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was being arranged, but old enough to understand that her life was about to change dramatically. The formal betrothal ceremony took place at Westminster in June 1109, marking Matilda's first appearance at a royal council. Surrounded by the greatest nobles of the realm, she stood as they swore oaths of allegiance that bound not just her future but England's relationship with the Holy Roman Empire. The ceremony was both celebration and contract, marking her transition from child to political asset. February 1110 brought the end of Matilda's English childhood. The ports of Dover witnessed a scene that would have seemed impossible to the Saxon kingdoms of her great-grandmother's time, an English princess departing to become Empress of the Romans, her ship carrying not just a young woman but the hopes and ambitions of an entire dynasty. The Channel crossing that winter was treacherous, with storms that seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions of leaving everything familiar behind. Matilda travelled with a retinue that included her tutors, servants, and a collection of treasures intended to demonstrate English wealth and sophistication to her new subjects. Among these were books, jewelry, and religious relics that would help maintain her connection to her homeland during the years ahead. The journey across northern France revealed a landscape still scarred by warfare and political fragmentation. Unlike England, where Norman conquest had created a unified kingdom under strong royal authority, France remained a patchwork of competing lordships, each jealously guarding its independence from royal control. This political weakness would prove advantageous to both English and German interests, as neither kingdom needed to fear unified French opposition to their alliance liege. Where Matilda first met her intended husband represented the cultural crossroads of medieval Europe. Here, Germanic and Latin traditions merged, creating a unique civilization that owed allegiance to neither French kings nor German emperors. It was fitting that this cosmopolitan city should witness the first meeting between the English princess and the future Holy Roman Emperor. Henry V, at 24, possessed the confidence and bearing expected of someone destined to rule the largest empire in Christendom since Charlemagne. His court was magnificent, filled with nobles who traced their ancestry back to the great Germanic tribes that had once challenged Rome itself. For 8-year-old Matilda, this first encounter with German imperial culture must have been both overwhelming and fascinating. The betrothal ceremony at Utrecht on April 10th marked her formal entry into the German political system. The ancient city, with its Roman foundations and medieval additions, symbolized the historical continuity that the Holy Roman Empire claimed to represent. As she exchanged vows with Henry, Matilda became part of a tradition that stretched back through Charlemagne to the Caesars themselves. Her coronation as German Queen at Mainz on July 25th was perhaps the most significant ceremony of her young life. The ancient cathedral, where German kings had been crowned for centuries, witnessed something unprecedented: an English princess receiving the crown that had once belonged to Germanic tribal queens. The ceremony combined Christian ritual with Germanic tradition, creating a moment that bridged cultures and histories. The considerable age gap between Matilda and Henry was 8, while he was 24, reflected the political rather than personal nature of their union. Medieval marriages among royalty were rarely about affection. They were diplomatic instruments designed to create lasting alliances between kingdoms. For Matilda, this meant accepting a destiny that prioritized duty over personal preference, a lesson that would shape her entire approach to life. Her guardian during these formative years was Archbishop Bruno of Trier, a scholar and diplomat who understood both the delicate nature of his charge and the importance of her eventual role. Under his guidance, Matilda began the complex process of transformation from English princess to German queen. This involved not just learning the German language and customs, but understanding the unique political structure of the Holy Roman Empire. Unlike England, where royal authority was absolute within defined borders, the empire was a confederation of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities held together by feudal obligations and imperial prestige. The emperor ruled not through direct control, but through a complex web of relationships with powerful nobles who maintained their own armies, courts, and territories. For Matilda, understanding this system was crucial to her future role as imperial consort. The years between her betrothal and marriage were spent in intensive preparation for her eventual duties. She studied imperial history, learning about the great emperors who had preceded her husband and the challenges they had faced. She mastered court protocol, understanding that every public appearance would be scrutinized for signs of imperial authority. Most importantly, she began to develop the political instincts that would serve her throughout her remarkable life. The wedding ceremony at Worms in January 1114 marked the culmination of this preparation period and the beginning of active participation in imperial governance. The city of Worms, with its magnificent cathedral and imperial palace, provided a setting worthy of the union between England's royal house and the Holy Roman Empire. The celebrations lasted for days, drawing nobles from across Europe to witness an alliance that promised to reshape the balance of continental power. As 1114 progressed, political storms began gathering across the empire that would test both new status and her personal resilience. Henry V's arrest of Archbishop Adalbert of Mainz and other German princes triggered rebellions that threatened to fragment the empire along traditional lines of division. These conflicts would provide Matilda with her first real experience of the brutal realities of medieval politics, where loyalty was contingent and power required constant vigilance to maintain. The rebellions also brought her first taste of the complex relationship between imperial authority and church power. The Holy Roman Empire's unique position as both secular kingdom and sacred institution meant that conflicts with church leaders could threaten the very foundations of imperial legitimacy. When Pope Paschal II excommunicated Henry V, it created a crisis that touched every aspect of imperial governance. For Matilda, these challenges represented both danger and opportunity. As Henry's wife, she shared in the consequences of his political decisions, but she also gained unprecedented access to the centers of power where these decisions were made. Her presence at council meetings, her involvement in ceremonial occasions, and her growing understanding of imperial administration all prepared her for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The decision to march into Italy in early 1116 marked a turning point in both the empire's struggle with the papacy and Matilda's personal development. The journey across the Alps was treacherous, made more dangerous by the political uncertainty that awaited them in Italy. But for Matilda, it represented her first opportunity to exercise real authority as she began taking an active role in imperial government. In Italy, she encountered a political landscape even more complex than Germany's. The peninsula was divided among competing powers: the Pope in Rome, Norman kingdoms in the south, Byzantine territories in the southeast, and various city-states that owed nominal allegiance to the empire, but guarded their independence jealously. Navigating these competing interests required diplomatic skills that Matilda was only beginning to develop. Her involvement in granting royal charters, dealing with petitioners, and participating in ceremonial occasions marked her emergence as a significant political figure in her own right. No longer simply Henry's consort, she was becoming a partner in imperial governance, her decisions carrying weight that extended far beyond personal or ceremonial matters. The advance on Rome in early 1117 represented the culmination of Henry's struggle with papal authority. For Matilda, it meant witnessing firsthand the ultimate confrontation between secular and spiritual power that defined medieval politics. The sight of the Eternal City, with its ancient monuments and Christian shrines, must have been overwhelming for a young woman who had grown up in the relatively modest surroundings of English royal courts. Pope Paschal's flight from Rome created both opportunity and crisis for the imperial couple. Without legitimate papal coronation, Henry's claim to imperial title remained questionable, but the Pope's absence also removed the primary obstacle to their immediate objectives. The arrival of papal envoy Maurice Burdine offered a solution that was both politically expedient and canonically ambiguous. The coronation ceremony at St. Peter's Basilica, whether at Easter or Pentecost, marked Matilda's transformation from German queen to Holy Roman Empress, standing in the most sacred church in Christendom, receiving a crown that claimed authority over all of Western Europe. She achieved a status that no English princess had ever held before. Yet the circumstances of the ceremony, conducted by an envoy rather than the Pope himself, under the shadow of political coercion, would cast doubt on her imperial title for years to come. The theological and legal complexities surrounding her coronation reflected the broader tensions within medieval Christianity between spiritual authority and temporal power. Matilda's claim to be legitimately crowned empress rested on technical arguments about papal delegation and the nature of imperial authority. But regardless of canonical disputes, The title gave her a prestige and authority that would prove invaluable in the struggles ahead. Her use of the imperial title from 1117 until her death demonstrated both her understanding of political symbolism and her determination to maintain the highest possible status regardless of changing circumstances. In an age when titles carried real power, her insistence on being addressed as Empress ensured that she could negotiate with kings and nobles as an equal rather than a subordinate. The year 1118 brought perhaps the greatest test of her early imperial career when Henry returned to Germany, leaving her as regent in Italy. At 16, she found herself governing one of the most politically complex regions in medieval Europe, responsible for maintaining imperial authority over nobles who had their own armies and territories, cities that valued their independence, and church leaders who questioned the legitimacy of her husband's rule. Though few records survive of her regency, the very fact that Henry entrusted her with such responsibility indicates both his confidence in her abilities and her demonstrated competence in imperial administration. The 2 years she spent governing Italy provided invaluable experience in the practical realities of medieval rulership, lessons that would serve her well when she later claimed the English throne. Her return to Lotharingia in 1119 to rejoin Henry marked the end of her Italian regency, but not her involvement in imperial governance. The reunion took place against the backdrop of Henry's ongoing negotiations with Pope Calixtus II, who had succeeded Paschal and was seeking a compromise that would end the long-running investiture controversy that had plagued the empire for decades. The Council of Worms in 1122, where Henry finally reached agreement with the papacy, represented both a triumph for imperial diplomacy and a validation of the political partnership that had developed between Henry and Matilda. Her probable presence at these negotiations demonstrated her evolution from ceremonial consort to active participant in the highest levels of European politics. Yet even as external threats were resolved, personal challenges remained. The couple's failure to produce an heir created both dynastic uncertainty and personal anguish. Contemporary chroniclers attributed their childlessness to divine displeasure with Henry's past conflicts with the Church. But modern historians recognize that infertility could affect any couple regardless of their spiritual standing. The blocked visit to England in 1122, prevented by Count Charles of Flanders, highlighted the ongoing tensions between imperial ambitions and family loyalties. Matilda's desire to see her father may have been motivated by personal affection, but historian Marjorie Chibnall's suggestion that she intended to discuss English succession questions reveals the political calculations that shaped even family relationships among medieval royalty. Henry's final illness in early 1122 brought their partnership to an end just as it had reached full maturity. His death on May 23, 1125, at Utrecht left Matilda widowed at 23, possessed of imperial insignia and treasures but facing an uncertain future as the empire prepared to elect a new ruler. Her decision to relinquish the imperial regalia to Archbishop Adalbert, while controversial, demonstrated both her understanding of political realities and her preparation for the next phase of her extraordinary life. As 1125 drew to a close, Matilda stood at a crossroads that would determine not just her personal future but the fate of kingdoms. Behind her lay 8 years of imperial marriage that had transformed an English princess into one of the most experienced female politicians in Europe. Ahead lay choices that would lead her back to England and into the greatest conflict of her remarkable life. The stage was set for a drama that would reshape the medieval world and establish her legacy as one of history's most formidable women. The journey home to Normandy carried more than just an English princess returning to her father's court. Carried the accumulated wisdom of empire, the hard-earned knowledge of statecraft, and the unshakable confidence of someone who had stood in the presence of temporal and spiritual power and found herself equal to both. Matilda had learned to command respect in a world where women were expected to remain silent, to exercise authority in a system designed to exclude them, and to navigate the treacherous waters of international politics with a skill that would have impressed her grandfather, the conqueror himself. Now, as her ship approached the Norman coast and the familiar towers of her father's castles came into view, she carried within her the seeds of what would become one of the most remarkable struggles in English history. The imperial crown might rest behind her in Germany, but the true test of her extraordinary character lay ahead. In the green fields of England and the hearts of a people who would learn that sometimes destiny chooses its own champions, regardless of their gender or the expectations of their age. The departure from the empire marked not an ending but a transformation, as Matilda carried with her the accumulated wisdom of imperial governance and the unshakable conviction that royal blood carried obligations that transcended personal comfort. Her ships crossing the Channel bore more than a widowed empress returning home. They carried the seeds of a conflict that would reshape England's destiny and challenge every assumption about who could wear a crown. Normandy, in 1125, welcomed back a daughter who had left as a child and returned as a woman shaped by empire. The duchy that had seemed vast in her childhood memories now appeared smaller, more provincial, after 8 years in the heart of European power. Yet the familiar sight of Norman castles rising from green valleys, the sound of French spoken with, the distinctive Norman accent, and the scent of apple orchards in bloom reminded her that this land remained part of her blood and bone. King Henry I received his daughter with a mixture of paternal affection and political calculation. The 23-year-old woman who stood before him bore little resemblance to the 80-year-old child who had departed for Germany so many years before. Imperial dignity had settled upon her like a mantle that could never be removed, and her bearing spoke of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Yet beneath this imperial composure, Henry detected the same intelligent determination that had marked her childhood. Now tempered by experience and sharpened by adversity, the royal court at Rouen buzzed with speculation about the empress's future. Widowed empresses faced limited choices in a world that defined women primarily through their relationships to men. She could retreat to a convent, embracing the religious life that many noble widows chose as an alternative to remarriage. She could remain at her father's court, serving as an advisor and diplomatic asset until age made her irrelevant to political calculations. Or she could remarry, using her imperial title and personal accomplishments to secure an advantageous alliance. For nearly a year, Matilda remained at court while her father evaluated his options and hers. Henry still harbored hopes that his second marriage to Adeliza of Louvain might produce a male heir, which would resolve the succession question without the complications that a female ruler would inevitably bring. But as months passed without signs of pregnancy, alternative arrangements began to occupy more of his thoughts and conversations. The political landscape that greeted Matilda's return had been fundamentally altered by a tragedy that occurred 5 years earlier, though its full implications were only now becoming clear. The memory of that November night in 1120 still haunted the royal court, casting shadows over every discussion of succession and dynasty. The White Ship disaster had changed everything, though its consequences had taken years to fully unfold. That fateful evening at Barfla had begun with celebration and ended with catastrophe. The fastest ship in the royal fleet, the White Ship, had been chosen to carry the cream of Norman nobility back to England after Henry I's successful campaign in Normandy. Among the passengers was William Adelin, the king's only legitimate son, and heir to the English throne. A young man whose death would leave a vacuum at the heart of the royal succession. The ship's crew had been drinking, as had many of the passengers, their revelry reflecting the confidence of youth and the intoxication of military victory. As they departed Barfleur harbour, racing to overtake the king's ship in a display of nautical bravado, none aboard could have imagined that they were sailing toward one of the most consequential maritime disasters in English history. The ship struck a rock just outside the harbour, foundering so quickly that only 2 survivors would live to tell the tale. William Adelin's death transformed Matilda from a valuable diplomatic asset into something far more significant, a potential heir to the English throne. In 1120, the concept of female succession was not unknown in European politics, but it remained controversial and fraught with complications. Some regions of France had begun accepting male primogeniture as the standard succession law, but England's Norman rulers had never established clear precedents for such situations. The Anglo-Norman succession had always been characterized by conflict and uncertainty. William the Conqueror's death had triggered a war between his sons William Rufus and Robert Curthose. Henry I himself had seized the throne through speed and political maneuvering rather than undisputed inheritance rights. The absence of clear succession laws meant that each royal death created opportunities for ambitious claimants and potential civil wars. Initially, Henry I had hoped to solve the succession crisis through remarriage and the birth of another son. His union with Adeliza of Louvain was designed to produce male heirs who would carry forward the Norman dynasty without the complications that female rule might bring. But as years passed without issue from this marriage, Henry was forced to confront the possibility that his daughter represented his best hope for dynastic continuity. The pool of potential male heirs presented its own complications. Stephen of Blois, son of Henry's sister Adela, possessed charm, military skill, and noble birth, but his claim rested on maternal inheritance rather than direct patrilineal descent. Theobald IV, Count of Blois, Stephen's elder brother, had an equally valid claim based on the same reasoning. William Clito, son of Robert Curthose, represented the most direct male line from William the Conqueror, but his father's rebellion against Henry made him politically unacceptable. Henry's illegitimate son, Robert of Gloucester, possessed many qualities that would have made him an excellent king: intelligence, loyalty, military skill, and deep understanding of English politics. But illegitimate birth carried significant disadvantages in an age when divine sanction was considered essential for royal authority. The Church's teachings on legitimate birth, combined with the practical difficulties of establishing stable succession through bastard lines, made Robert an unlikely candidate despite his personal merits. As 1126 drew to a close, Henry I made a decision that would reshape English history. Rather than continue hoping for a male heir or selecting from among his nephews, he chose to designate Matilda as his successor. This choice reflected both his assessment of her capabilities and his determination to maintain direct control over the succession process. By naming his daughter rather than a nephew, he ensured that power would remain within his immediate family rather than passing to a collateral line. The Christmas court of 1126 witnessed an unprecedented ceremony when the greatest nobles of the Anglo-Norman realm gathered at Westminster to swear allegiance to Matilda as Henry's heir. This oath-taking represented more than a simple recognition of succession rights. It was an attempt to bind the nobility to support female rule in an age when such support could not be taken for granted. The ceremony marked Matilda's formal entry into English politics as something more than a diplomatic asset or potential bride. Yet even as the nobles swore their oaths, many harbored private reservations about the wisdom of female rule. Medieval concepts of monarchy emphasized military leadership, and women were generally considered unsuited for the physical demands of medieval warfare. Queens could rule as regents for minor sons or as consorts sharing their husband's authority, but independent female monarchy remained controversial and largely untested in England. The question of Matilda's remarriage became increasingly urgent, as Henry I contemplated the practical challenges of establishing her succession. A female ruler would need military support, political alliances, and the kind of masculine partnerships that medieval society considered essential for effective governance. The choice of husband would therefore determine not just Matilda's personal future, but the entire character of the coming reign. Henry's strategic vision focused on the southern borders of Normandy, where the rising power of Anjou posed both threats and opportunities. The Angevin counties had grown increasingly powerful under the leadership of Fulk V, a skilled military commander who controlled vital territories along Normandy's frontier. An alliance with Anjou could secure the southern borders while providing the military resources that Matilda would need to defend her inheritance. Geoffrey of Anjou, Fulk's eldest son, represented an attractive candidate for several reasons beyond mere political convenience. The Angevin house possessed ancient noble lineage, extensive lands, and growing military power. Geoffrey himself, though young, showed promise as both warrior and administrator. Most importantly, from Henry's perspective, an Angevin marriage would create a power bloc capable of defending both Normandy and England against French interference. The previous connection between the royal house and Anjou through William Adeline's betrothal to Fulk's daughter had demonstrated the potential benefits of such an alliance. The White Ship disaster had ended that arrangement and created tensions over the marriage dowry, leading Fulk to support William Clito against Henry's interests. Rebuilding the Angevin alliance through Matilda's marriage offered a way to repair these damaged relationships while securing future cooperation for Matilda. The prospect of marrying Geoffrey represented a significant reduction in status from her imperial marriage. As Holy Roman Empress, she had ranked among the highest nobility in Europe, her husband ruling an empire that claimed precedence over all other Christian kingdoms. Marriage to the son of a count, regardless of his personal qualities or territorial holdings, represented a clear diminishment of her royal dignity. The age difference between Matilda and Geoffrey created additional complications, beyond mere questions of status. At 25, Matilda possessed the experience and authority that came from years of imperial governance, while 13-year-old Geoffrey remained a boy still learning the fundamentals of noble behavior. The reversal of traditional age dynamics, where husbands typically surpassed their wives in both age and experience, highlighted the unusual nature of this proposed alliance. Despite her reservations, Matilda ultimately accepted the marriage arrangement after consultation with church leaders and family advisors. Archbishop Hilbert of Tours played a crucial role in persuading her to approve the match, likely emphasizing both her duty to her father's kingdom and the political necessities that made the alliance essential for future stability. The decision reflected her growing understanding that personal preferences must yield to political requirements in royal marriages. The formal betrothal ceremony at Rouen in May 1127 marked the beginning of a new phase in Matilda's life and the crystallization of Henry I's succession strategy. Surrounded by leading nobles, including Robert of Gloucester and Brian Fitz-Count, Matilda pledged herself to a marriage that would reshape the political map of northwestern Europe. The ceremony bound not just to individuals, but to dynasties, whose union would create the foundation for a new royal house. The year between betrothal and marriage witnessed significant changes in the Angevin succession as Fulkvi prepared for his departure to the Holy Land. His decision to seek the crown of Jerusalem created opportunities for Geoffrey to assume greater authority in Anjou, while also demonstrating the international scope of noble ambitions in the 12th century. The connection between crusading ideals and territorial/expansion reflected the complex motivations that drove medieval nobility toward both spiritual and worldly goals. Henry I's decision to knight Geoffrey before the wedding ceremony demonstrated both the political significance of the alliance and the personal respect that the English king had developed for his future son-in-law. The knighting represented Geoffrey's formal entry into the highest ranks of medieval nobility, while also symbolizing his acceptance into the extended royal family. This ceremony connected him to a tradition of knightly valor that would prove crucial in the military challenges ahead. The wedding at Le Mans on June 17, 1128, brought together representatives from across northwestern Europe to witness the union that would create the Angevin Empire. The cathedral setting, with its ancient stones and soaring arches, provided an appropriately sacred backdrop for vows that carried implications far beyond personal commitment. The presence of bishops from Le Mans and Sees emphasized the Church's blessing on an alliance that promised to reshape the balance of European power. Fulk's final departure for Jerusalem in 1129 left Geoffrey as Count of Anjou and Maine, transforming him overnight from a count's heir into a territorial ruler with responsibilities that matched his new wife's expectations. This elevation in status helped address some of the inequality that had characterized their betrothal, though it could not entirely eliminate the fundamental differences in their backgrounds and temperaments. The early years of their marriage revealed the personal incompatibilities that political arrangements could not overcome. Matilda and Geoffrey found themselves poorly matched in temperament, interests, and expectations, their relationship characterized more by duty than affection. The cultural differences between imperial Germanic traditions and French Angevin customs created additional sources of friction in a union that both parties approached as a political necessity, rather than a personal choice. Questions surrounding Matilda's dowry created ongoing tensions that highlighted the ambiguous nature of her position within the Angevin territories. While Henry I had granted her various Norman castles, the timing of their actual transfer remained unclear, leaving Geoffrey uncertain about his immediate territorial gains from the marriage. This uncertainty reflected broader questions about the relationship between Matilda's English inheritance and her new husband's continental holdings. The temporary separation that followed their wedding demonstrated the severity of their personal differences and the challenges of forcing political compatibility where emotional harmony was absent. Matilda's return to Normandy suggested her unwillingness to accept a subordinate role in Angevin territories, while Geoffrey may have struggled to accommodate a wife whose imperial experience exceeded his own. Political knowledge, Henry I's apparent blame of Geoffrey for the separation revealed the English king's protective attitude toward his daughter and his understanding that successful marriage required accommodation from both parties. The eventual reconciliation in 1131 represented a triumph of political necessity over personal preference. as both Matilda and Geoffrey recognized that their individual goals required cooperative partnership regardless of their private feelings. The reconciliation between Matilda and Geoffrey in 1131 marked a turning point in their relationship and the beginning of a new phase in English succession planning. Matilda's return to England in August of that year provided her father with an opportunity to reaffirm the succession arrangements while also ensuring that his daughter's marriage would produce the heirs necessary for dynastic continuity. The Great Council meeting in September 1131 served multiple purposes beyond the immediate question of Matilda's return to her husband. The assembly provided Henry I with a forum for securing renewed oaths of allegiance to his daughter, while also demonstrating the nobility's continued commitment to female succession, despite the obvious challenges it would bring. This second oath ceremony emphasized the unprecedented nature of the succession arrangements and the king's determination to bind his nobles to support them. The birth of Matilda's first son, in March 1133, at Le Mans represented a triumph for both personal and political reasons. The future Henry II entered the world as the potential heir to both English and Angevin territories, his bloodline uniting Norman, Saxon, and Angevin claims in a combination that promised to create unprecedented territorial unity. For Henry I, the birth of a grandson provided both joy and relief, confirming that his daughter's marriage could indeed produce the heirs necessary for stable succession. Henry's delight at his grandson's birth reflected more than mere grandfatherly affection. It represented validation of his entire succession strategy. The infant Henry embodied the fusion of different noble traditions that the king had sought to achieve through his daughter's carefully arranged marriage. Norman administrative skills, Saxon legitimacy, and Angevin military prowess combined in this child who might one day rule territories stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. The king's journey to Rouen to see his new grandson demonstrated the importance he placed on this birth and his desire to establish personal bonds with the child, who might carry forward his dynasty. These early meetings between grandfather and heir created emotional connections that would influence political decisions in years to come. As Henry I's protective instincts toward his grandson would shape his approach to both succession planning and territorial defense, the birth of Geoffrey in 1134 at Rouen nearly cost Matilda her life, highlighting the dangerous realities of medieval childbirth even for the highest-ranking women. The difficult labor and her apparent closeness to death forced consideration of practical questions about burial arrangements and inheritance that revealed ongoing tensions between English and Norman priorities. Matilda's preference for burial at Bec Abbey reflected her personal spiritual attachments, while Henry's desire for interment at Rouen Cathedral emphasized political and dynastic considerations. Matilda's recovery from this life-threatening childbirth represented both personal triumph and political necessity, as her survival ensured the continuation of succession plans that depended heavily on her active leadership. The birth of a second grandson further strengthened the royal lineage, while also providing backup heirs in case of childhood mortality, a constant concern in an age when infant death rates remained tragically high even among the nobility. Henry's possible insistence on additional oaths following his second grandson's birth reflected his understanding that noble loyalty required constant reinforcement and renewal. The king's advancing age made succession questions increasingly urgent, while the growth of his daughter's family provided both opportunities and complications for future territorial arrangements. Each birth brought celebration but also raised New questions about how vast territories might be divided among multiple heirs, the increasingly strained relationship between Henry I and his daughter's family reflected growing tensions over the practical implementation of succession arrangements. Matilda and Geoffrey's proposal that the king immediately transfer Norman castles to their control demonstrated their concern about the loyalty they could expect from Norman nobles after Henry's death. Their demand for immediate oaths of allegiance from the Norman nobility revealed deep anxieties about the support they might receive when the succession actually occurred. Henry's angry refusal of these demands reflected his determination to maintain royal authority during his lifetime, while also revealing his concerns about Geoffrey's ambitions. The king may have feared that transferring castles immediately would encourage his son-in-law to challenge royal authority while Henry still lived, potentially creating the kind of succession crisis that the marriage was designed to prevent rather than resolve. The fresh rebellion in southern Normandy that erupted in 1135 provided Matilda and Geoffrey with an opportunity to demonstrate their military capabilities, while also challenging Henry's authority in ways that troubled the aging king. Their decision to support the rebels represented both a bid for territorial control and a test of royal power that revealed the underlying tensions within the royal family about timing and authority. These military confrontations highlighted fundamental disagreements about the relationship between current royal authority and future succession rights. While Matilda and Geoffrey viewed their intervention as preparation for eventual rule, Henry interpreted it as premature challenge to his existing authority. This conflict of perspectives would prove prophetic of larger challenges that would emerge after the king's death. Henry I's unexpected death near Lyons-le-Forêt on December 1st, 1135, occurred at the worst possible moment for his daughter's succession. With Matilda and Geoffrey actively campaigning against royal forces in southern Normandy, they appeared more as rebels than legitimate heirs when news of the king's death began to spread. Their absence from the royal court at the moment of succession created a power vacuum that their enemies were quick to exploit. The uncertainty surrounding Henry's final words about the succession reflected the confused circumstances of his death and the political motivations of different chroniclers writing after subsequent events had shaped their perspectives. Sources favorable to Matilda suggested that Henry reaffirmed his intent to leave all his territories to his daughter, while those supporting Stephen claimed that the dying king had renounced his previous plans and apologized for forcing the nobles to swear unwilling oaths that the immediate aftermath of Henry's death revealed. The weaknesses in succession arrangements that had seemed secure during the king's lifetime. Many of the nobles who had sworn allegiance to Matilda were bound by oaths to remain in Normandy until Henry's proper burial, preventing them from returning to England to secure her interests there. This technicality, which seemed minor in peaceful times, proved crucial in the rapid political maneuvering that followed the king's death. Matilda and Geoffrey's decision to march into southern Normandy and seize castles around Argenton reflected both their understanding of political realities and their immediate territorial priorities. These strongholds had formed part of Matilda's disputed dowry, and securing them provided both strategic advantages and symbolic validation of their claims. However, their focus on Norman territories meant they were unable to respond quickly to developments in England. The couple's inability to advance further into Normandy, combined with increased resistance from Norman nobles and rebellion in Anjou itself, demonstrated the limitations of their immediate military capabilities. Matilda's pregnancy with her third son William added additional complications to their strategic planning. Though historians debate how significantly her condition affected their military options during this crucial period. While Matilda and Geoffrey struggled with rebellions and territorial disputes in Normandy, momentous events were unfolding across the Channel that would determine the perennial immediate future of the English crown. Stephen of Blois, conveniently positioned in Boulogne when news of Henry I's death arrived, moved with decisive speed that would prove crucial in the coming struggle for royal authority. Stephen's journey to England demonstrated both his preparedness for this opportunity and his understanding that success in medieval succession disputes often depended on speed rather than legitimacy. Accompanied by his military household, he represented the kind of immediate armed presence that could seize control before opponents had time to organize effective resistance. His crossing of the Channel marked the beginning of a conflict that would consume England for nearly 2 decades. Robert of Gloucester's initial attempt to block Stephen's access through the ports of Dover and Canterbury revealed the divided loyalties that Henry I's death had created among the English nobility. Robert's position as both Matilda's half-brother and one of England's most powerful nobles made his opposition crucial, but his inability to prevent Stephen's advance demonstrated the limitations of noble resistance without royal backing or clear succession arrangements. Stephen's arrival at the edges of London by December 8th marked a crucial moment in the succession crisis, as control of the capital would provide both symbolic authority and practical resources necessary for establishing royal government. The city's support for Stephen reflected both his personal popularity and the citizens' expectation that a new king would reward their early loyalty with favorable privileges and expanded rights. The London crowd's proclamation of Stephen as king represented more than simple enthusiasm. It reflected the urban population's preference for immediate stability over uncertain succession disputes. Medieval cities thrived on predictable governance and commercial security, making them natural supporters of any candidate who could quickly establish effective authority. Stephen's promise of new rights and privileges resonated with merchant communities that valued practical benefits over abstract succession principles. Henry, Bishop of Winchester's support for his brother Stephen proved decisive in securing church backing for the usurpation. As both a royal brother and senior church leader, Henry could provide theological arguments for supporting Stephen while also delivering institutional church support that was crucial for legitimate royal authority. In medieval society, his argument that Henry I had been wrong to force unwilling oaths from his nobles provided convenient justification for breaking previous commitments to Matilda. The bishop's suggestion that the dying king had changed his mind on his deathbed offered Stephen's supporters a face-saving explanation for abandoning their sworn allegiance to Matilda. Whether or not Henry I had actually expressed such sentiments, the claim provided useful political cover for nobles who preferred male rule but needed justification for breaking solemn oaths witnessed by God and the Church. Stephen's coronation at Westminster Abbey on December 22nd represented the culmination of his rapid seizure of power and the formal beginning of his reign. The ceremony, conducted with all the traditional pageantry of royal coronations, provided symbolic legitimacy that complemented his practical control of the capital and key institutions. The presence of church leaders and nobles at the ceremony demonstrated the breadth of support that Stephen had managed to assemble in just 2 weeks. The Norman nobilities gathering at La Neubourg to discuss supporting Theobald of Blois revealed the complex calculations that Henry I's death had triggered. Throughout the Anglo-Norman realm, the nobles' preference for Theobald as the eldest grandson of William the Conqueror, demonstrated their discomfort with female rule, but also their recognition that legitimate male claims existed within the extended royal family. The argument that Theobald possessed the most valid claim as eldest grandson reflected medieval inheritance customs that often favored seniority over direct descent. This reasoning would have excluded both Matilda as a woman and Stephen as a younger brother, creating a succession that followed traditional primogeniture principles. The noble's certainty that Theobald was preferable to Matilda revealed the depth of resistance to female rule among the continental aristocracy. The sudden news of Stephen's imminent coronation transformed the entire character of these Norman discussions, as the prospect of dividing England and Normandy between different rulers presented strategic nightmares that few nobles were prepared to accept. The interconnected nature of Anglo-Norman holdings meant that supporting different rulers on opposite sides of the Channel would create impossible conflicts of loyalty. For families with estates in both territories, Theobald's immediate loss of support demonstrated the practical limitations of theoretical claims when faced with accomplished facts. Medieval politics often favored rapid action over careful deliberation, and Stephen's speed in securing the English crown made continued resistance seem both futile and potentially dangerous. The Norman nobles' unwillingness to fragment the Anglo-Norman realm reflected their understanding of the practical benefits that unity provided. Matilda's birth of her third son, William, at Argenton on July 22, 1136, occurred against this backdrop of political upheaval and territorial uncertainty. The child's arrival provided both personal joy and political complications, as another male heir strengthened her dynastic claims, while also adding to the challenges of managing territorial inheritance. The timing of William's birth, in the midst of ongoing conflicts over succession and territory, symbolized the intersection of personal and political destinies that characterized medieval royal life. Her establishment of a household in the border regions between Normandy and her disputed territories reflected both strategic necessity and political ambition. By positioning herself on the frontier, Matilda could maintain pressure on contested areas, while also demonstrating her determination to pursue her inheritance rights regardless of Stephen's success in England. This positioning also allowed her to maintain contact with supporters on both sides of the Channel, while building the military resources necessary for eventual invasion. The 3 years that Matilda spent operating from these border territories provided crucial preparation for the larger conflict ahead. During this period, she developed the military and administrative capabilities that would be essential for challenging Stephen's rule, while also building the network of alliances and supporters that would make invasion possible. These years of preparation transformed her from a displaced heir into a serious military threat to Stephen's regime. As 1139 approached, the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the immediate future of the English crown, but the broader question of whether women could rule in their own right in medieval Europe. Matilda's years of preparation, Stephen's established control of England, and the complex web of loyalties and interests that connected supporters on both sides ensured that the coming conflict would test every assumption about legitimate authority, military power, and political loyalty in the medieval world. The civil war that historians would later call the Anarchy was about to begin, and with it, Matilda's greatest test as both ruler and woman in a world that questioned her right to either title, that the wind that swept across the Norman countryside in December 1135 carried more than winter's chill. It bore the whispers of a kingdom's transformation, the dying breath of one age and the uncertain birth of another. In the shadow of death's sudden arrival, two cousins would discover that blood meant less than opportunity, that promises made in royal halls could dissolve like morning frost when crowns lay unguarded. The stage was set for England's greatest succession crisis, a conflict that would drench the realm in blood and establish forever the price of challenging destiny itself. Stephen of Blois moved like a man possessed by divine purpose as news of Henry I's death reached him in the familiar halls of Boulogne. The December air crackled with possibility as he gathered his household knights, men whose loyalties had been purchased with generous grants and whose swords would write the opening chapter of England's bloodiest civil war. His wife Matilda, Countess of Boulogne in her own right, understood immediately what her husband's haste portended. This was the moment they had prepared for, though perhaps never truly believed would come. The Channel crossing that brought Stephen to English shores was swift, aided by favourable winds that seemed to mock the storm gathering over the kingdom's future. Dover's white cliffs, so often a barrier against foreign invasion, welcomed this Norman prince who carried within his veins the blood of conquerors and the ambition to rule. The ports that Robert of Gloucester had attempted to garrison proved insufficient. Against Stephen's determination and the speed of his advance, London received him as cities have always received those who promise prosperity and privilege. The merchants and guilds, ever practical in their loyalties, saw in Stephen a king who would grant them the charters and freedoms that royal favour could bestow. The crowds that proclaimed him monarch in the streets understood little of the legal niceties surrounding succession. They knew only that a strong man had arrived to claim the throne while its rightful heir remained distant in Anjou, distracted by rebellion and pregnancy. Henry of Winchester, Stephen's younger brother and Bishop of Winchester, proved as crucial to this bloodless coup as any armed knight. His clerical robes carried more authority than steel when it came to legitimizing what was essentially a theft of royal inheritance. The Church's support, so carefully cultivated through Stephen's reputation for piety and generosity, provided the spiritual sanction that transformed usurpation into rightful kingship. The theological arguments that Henry of Winchester presented to justify his brother's claim revealed the malleable nature of medieval political theory. The oath that Stephen had sworn to support Matilda's succession could be nullified. The bishop argued because it had been extracted under duress and contrary to natural law. No kingdom should be forced to accept female rule when a suitable male heir existed. The supposed deathbed change of heart attributed to Henry I, while historically questionable, provided convenient cover for those seeking to justify their abandonment of previous commitments. Westminster Abbey's ancient stones witnessed Stephen's coronation on December 22, 1135, a ceremony that blended sacred ritual with political necessity. The crown that settled upon his brow carried the weight of conquest, the accumulated authority of Norman rule in England, but it also bore the seeds of future conflict. Every noble who bent the knee that day understood that they were participants in a gamble whose consequences could not yet be calculated. The new king's early actions revealed both political acumen and a generous nature that had made him popular among the Anglo-Norman nobility. Royal charters flowed from the royal chancery like water from a broken dam, granting privileges, confirming grants, and binding the recipients to his cause through interest. Stephen understood that loyalty purchased with favour could prove more durable than loyalty demanded through force. Yet even as England celebrated its new monarch, darker currents moved beneath the surface of apparent acceptance. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother and one of the most powerful men in the realm, maintained an ominous silence from his strongholds in the west. His eventual submission to Stephen in 1136 carried the hollow ring of expedience rather than conviction, a strategic withdrawal that preserved his strength for future action in Normandy. The situation remained fluid and dangerous. The Norman barons' brief consideration of Theobald of Blois as their duke had evaporated with news of Stephen's rapid success in England, but their acceptance of his authority remained conditional. The duchy that William the Conqueror had forged through iron will and administrative genius now faced potential fragmentation between competing claimants, each with legitimate grounds for their ambitions. Matilda's initial response to Stephen's usurpation revealed the strategic patience that would characterize her entire campaign for the throne. Rather than rushing into immediate military action, she consolidated her position in Anjou and Normandy, using the intervening years to build the coalition that would eventually challenge Stephen's rule. Her marriage to Geoffrey of Anjou, so personally distasteful but politically essential, now proved its worth as Angevin resources and military expertise became available for her cause. The birth of her son, Henry, in March 1133, had transformed Matilda's position from that of a disappointed claimant to the mother of a future king. The infant who would one day rule as Henry II represented not just personal fulfillment but dynastic legitimacy, proof that God's favor rested upon her line rather than Stephen's. The child's Angevin heritage, far from weakening his claim to England, actually strengthened it by providing access to resources and allies that no purely English claimant could command. Geoffrey's parallel campaign to conquer Normandy proceeded with methodical precision throughout the late 1130s. Each castle that fell to Angevin forces weakened Stephen's position and demonstrated the practical consequences of divided authority. The duke who could not protect his Norman inheritance could hardly claim divine appointment to rule England. The systematic reduction of Norman strongholds served both military and propaganda purposes, undermining Stephen's prestige while building momentum for Matilda's eventual invasion. The year 1138 brought increasing signs that Stephen's early popularity was beginning to wane under the pressures of governance and the growing threat from his enemies. The generous grants that had purchased initial loyalty were draining the royal treasury, while the promised stability proved elusive as various rebellions erupted across the kingdom. The king, who had seemed so capable during his bloodless seizure of power, appeared less adept at the long-term challenges of medieval rulership. David I of Scotland, Matilda's uncle, provided another front in the growing conflict through his invasion of northern England, ostensibly acting to support his niece's claim. David's primary motivation was the expansion of Scottish territory and influence. The brutal campaign that culminated in the Battle of the Standard in 1138 demonstrated that this succession dispute would not remain a genteel conflict between civilized claimants, but would unleash all the savagery that medieval warfare could provide. September 1139 brought autumn storms to the English Channel, and with them the fulfillment of Stephen's worst fears. Matilda's invasion fleet, modest in size but carrying the accumulated grievances of 4 years of usurped rule, approached the Dorset coast like an instrument of divine judgment. The ships that bore her household knights and Flemish mercenaries also carried something more dangerous, the unshakable conviction that she fought for her rightful inheritance. Arundel Castle, where Matilda first set foot on English soil as a claimant to the throne, held symbolic significance that transcended its military value. The fortress belonged to Adeliza of Louvain, Henry I's second wife, whose reception of the Empress demonstrated that even Stephen's supporters harbored doubts about the legitimacy of his rule. The Dowager Queen's willingness to shelter her late husband's designated heir sent shockwaves through the Loyalist party and encouraged others to question their allegiances. Robert of Gloucester's simultaneous landing in the West country revealed the careful coordination that had preceded this invasion, while Matilda established her presence in the south. Her half-brother began the systematic conquest of his own estates and the recruitment of those nobles whose loyalty to Stephen had always been conditional. The two-pronged approach stretched royal resources and forced Stephen to choose between immediate threats, a decision that would have lasting consequences for his cause. Stephen's response to Matilda's landing demonstrated both his personal courage and his strategic limitations. The king's decision to march immediately to Arundel revealed his understanding that allowing the Empress to consolidate her position would prove fatal to his reign. Yet his failure to bring sufficient force to conduct a proper siege allowed Matilda to escape his initial attempt at capture, a failure that would haunt him throughout the coming conflict. The safe conduct that allowed Matilda to leave Arundel and join Robert in the West has puzzled historians for centuries. Some see it as evidence of Stephen's chivalrous nature, his unwillingness to use overwhelming force against a woman. Others interpret it as political calculation, recognizing that martyring Henry I's daughter might create more problems than allowing her to continue her rebellion. Whatever his motivation, the decision effectively ended Stephen's best chance of terminating the succession crisis before it could begin in earnest. The West Country that welcomed Matilda's cause represented England's ancient Saxon heartland, regions where Norman rule remained an imposition rather than an accepted fact. Bristol, Robert of Gloucester's power base, became the centre of resistance to Stephen's authority, its merchants and citizens understanding that their prosperity depended on backing the winning side in this dynastic struggle. The choice between established authority and rightful inheritance would determine the fate of individuals and communities across the realm. Winter 1139 brought no respite from the spreading conflict as both sides prepared for the campaigns that would follow. With spring's arrival, castles became focal points of loyalty and resistance, their stone walls determining the boundaries between competing authorities. The England that had known 40 years of relative peace under Norman rule began its descent into the chaos that chroniclers would later term the Anarchy. Matilda's court at Bristol established the institutional framework necessary for sustained resistance to Stephen's rule. Royal charters issued in her name competed with those emanating from Stephen's chancery, creating competing claims to legitimacy that forced recipients to choose between present security and future advantage. The Empress, who had learned statecraft in the imperial courts of Germany, brought sophisticated administrative practices to her rebellion, transforming it from mere military resistance into an alternative government. The recruitment of military force proceeded along predictable lines, as both sides sought to convert feudal obligations into effective fighting strength. The mercenary companies that both Stephen and Matilda employed brought professional military expertise to supplement the unreliable service of feudal levies. These hired soldiers, loyal only to regular payment, would prove crucial in determining the conflict's course, their shifting allegiances reflecting the fortunes of their respective employers. Religious support, so crucial to medieval legitimacy, remained divided throughout the early phases of the conflict. While Stephen retained the backing of his brother Henry of Winchester and much of the English church hierarchy, Matilda could point to the obvious injustice of her dispossession and the oaths that had been sworn to support her succession. Monasteries and cathedral chapters found themselves forced to choose between spiritual principles and political prudence, their decisions often determining the fate of surrounding territories. The year 1140 witnessed the transformation of localized rebellion into kingdom-wide civil war as the conflict spread beyond its initial centers in the west and south. Castle sieges became the primary form of military activity, their outcomes determining control over surrounding countryside and the resources necessary to sustain armies. The patient work of reduction and consolidation replaced the dramatic campaigns of earlier Norman warfare, reflecting the essentially defensive nature of 12th century military technology. Ranulph of Chester's alliance with Matilda brought one of England's most powerful magnates into her camp and threatened Stephen's control over the vital Midlands. The Earl's grievances against royal authority, rooted in disputes over lands and privileges, demonstrated how personal resentments could merge with dynastic politics to create lasting opposition. Chester's military resources and strategic position made him a valuable ally whose support significantly enhanced Matilda's chances of ultimate success. Lincoln Cathedral's ancient spires witnessed one of medieval England's most decisive battles on February 2, 1141, when the forces of civil war finally met in open combat. The frozen ground beneath the city walls would run red with blood before the day ended, and the outcome would forever alter the balance of power between Stephen and Matilda. What began as a siege to recapture a rebellious castle became the defining moment of the entire succession crisis. The events leading to Lincoln revealed how quickly local disputes could escalate into kingdom-threatening conflicts. Ranulph of Chester's seizure of Lincoln Castle during the Christmas celebrations of 1140 represented more than simple opportunism. It was a calculated challenge to royal authority that Stephen could not ignore without appearing weak before his remaining supporters. The king's response, swift and decisive, brought him to Lincoln with a substantial army determined to crush this latest rebellion. Stephen's siege of Lincoln Castle proceeded according to established medieval practice, with the royal forces attempting to starve the garrison into submission while preventing relief forces from reaching the defenders. The king's confidence in this approach reflected his understanding that time favored the besiegers, particularly given the onset of winter weather that would make sustained military operations increasingly difficult for any relieving force. Matilda's decision to march to Lincoln's relief represented a calculated gamble that would either destroy Stephen's reign or end her own hopes forever. The Empress understood that allowing Ranulph to fall would eliminate one of her most powerful supporters and demonstrate her inability to protect those who declared for her cause. The army she assembled for this crucial campaign represented the full strength of her party, including Robert of Gloucester's experienced troops and the Welsh allies whose fierce fighting abilities had already proven their worth. The approach of Matilda's relief force forced Stephen into a dilemma that would define his entire reign. He could abandon the siege and withdraw to safer territory, preserving his army but appearing weak before friend and enemy alike. Alternatively, he could maintain the siege and risk being caught between the castle garrison and the approaching relief force. His decision to remain and fight reflected both personal courage and the strategic understanding that retreat would be interpreted as defeat. February 2nd dawned cold and clear, providing ideal conditions for the medieval battle that would determine England's future. The deployment of forces reflected the military realities of 12th century warfare, with heavily armored cavalry forming the core of both armies while supporting infantry, provided additional strength and flexibility. Stephen's position, caught between the city and the approaching enemy, was tactically disadvantageous, but not hopeless if his forces could maintain their cohesion. The battle's opening phases followed conventional patterns as both sides maneuvered for advantage while their leaders delivered the ritual speeches that medieval warfare demanded. Stephen's address to his troops emphasized loyalty to legitimate authority and the rewards that victory would bring, while Matilda's commanders stressed the justice of their cause and the illegitimacy of the usurper they fought. These preliminary rituals completed, the armies closed for combat that would be decided by steel rather than words. Robert of Gloucester's tactical brilliance became evident as the battle developed, his deployment of troops maximizing their effectiveness while exploiting weaknesses in the royal formation. The Earl's military experience, gained through decades of service to Henry I, proved invaluable in managing the complex coordination required for medieval battle. His personal leadership inspired the troops under his command, while his strategic vision ensured that tactical successes translated into broader advantages. The collapse of Stephen's cavalry marked the turning point of the engagement, as his noble supporters fled the field rather than risk capture or death for a cause that suddenly appeared hopeless. This abandonment reflected the conditional nature of feudal loyalty, particularly when military defeat made continued resistance appear futile. The king found himself increasingly isolated as his army disintegrated around him, his personal valor unable to compensate for the broader failure of his forces. Stephen's capture near Lincoln Cathedral represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in English royal history. The king, who had awakened that morning confident of victory, found himself a prisoner by evening, his freedom and perhaps his life dependent on the mercy of enemies who had every reason to show him none. The symbolic significance of his capture at England's ancient seat of learning added theological weight to what was already a political catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. The immediate aftermath of Lincoln saw jubilation in Matilda's camp, as supporters who had risked everything for her cause finally witnessed tangible proof of divine favor. The capture of an anointed king provided unprecedented validation for her claim to the throne, while simultaneously eliminating the primary obstacle to her coronation. The Empress, who had landed at Arundel as a desperate exile, now held the fate of kingdoms in her hands. News of Stephen's defeat spread across England with unprecedented speed, carried by messengers whose tidings would determine the loyalties of communities and individuals throughout the realm. Castles that had resisted Matilda's cause suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable, their commanders forced to choose between hopeless resistance and expedient submission. The political landscape that had seemed fixed since 1135 was suddenly as malleable as clay in the hands of a determined Potter. London, in early 1141, prepared to receive its first queen regnant, as news of Stephen's capture transformed the political calculations of merchants, nobles, and common citizens alike. The great city that had proclaimed Stephen king 6 years earlier now faced the prospect of acknowledging Matilda's superior claim, a reversal that revealed the pragmatic nature of urban loyalty in an age when survival depended on backing the winning side. The Thames carried more than commerce in those spring months. It bore the hopes and fears of a kingdom in transition. Matilda's approach to London was carefully orchestrated to demonstrate both her authority and her mercy toward those who had opposed her. The Empress understood that ruling required more than military victory. It demanded the acceptance of those she would govern. Her entry into the city on horseback, surrounded by the banners of great houses that had declared for her cause, was designed to inspire awe and submission in equal measure. The Winchester ceremony that preceded her arrival in London provided crucial ecclesiastical legitimacy for her claims. Henry of Winchester, Stephen's own brother, had pragmatically abandoned his captured sibling to embrace the new political reality. His public acknowledgement of Matilda as Lady of the English carried immense symbolic weight, demonstrating that even the most committed supporters of the old regime recognized the futility of continued resistance. The title Lady of the English itself reflected the careful balance Matilda sought to maintain between asserting her authority and respecting the constitutional sensibilities of her subjects. Unlike her father and grandfather, who had ruled as kings by right of conquest, she claimed the throne through inheritance and divine appointment. The feminine form of royal address acknowledged biological reality while asserting political equality with any male monarch. Westminster Abbey, where English kings had been crowned since Harold Godwinson, awaited Matilda's formal coronation with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. The ancient church that had witnessed the transformation of Norman conquerors into English kings would now see whether a woman could successfully claim the same sacred authority. The preparations for this unprecedented ceremony revealed both the excitement and uncertainty that surrounded Matilda's triumph. Yet even as the crown jewels were prepared for the coronation ceremony, warning signs accumulated that suggested Matilda's victory might prove more fragile than it appeared. The London crowds that had once cheered Stephen's accession now watched the Empress with suspicion, their enthusiasm dampened by reports of her imperious behavior and her apparent preference for foreign advisers over English councillors. The honeymoon period that typically followed political upheaval was notably absent from Matilda's reception. The Empress's demands for financial support from London's merchant community revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate relationship between royal authority and urban autonomy. Her apparent assumption that the city owed her immediate and substantial aid without corresponding grants of privilege suggested an imperial mindset poorly suited to English political traditions. The merchants who had prospered under Stephen's relatively light touch found themselves facing taxation that threatened their accumulated wealth. Popular hostility toward Matilda's cause crystallized around her. Angevin connections and her perceived arrogance toward English customs and concerns. The woman who had spent years learning to navigate the complex politics of the Holy Roman Empire seemed unable to adapt to the different requirements of English kingship. Her foreign mannerisms and autocratic expectations grated against subjects who had grown accustomed to Stephen's more approachable style of monarchy. The crisis that would destroy Matilda's chances of peaceful coronation began with seemingly minor disputes over taxation and royal prerogatives. London's citizens, already resentful of her financial demands, interpreted her imperious responses to their petitions as evidence of the tyrannical rule they could expect under her reign. The murmurs of discontent that had initially been confined to taverns and marketplaces began to spread throughout the city's neighborhoods. June 24, 1141, brought the culmination of mounting tensions as London's population rose in spontaneous rebellion against the Empress's authority. The crowds that filled the streets demanded her immediate departure, their anger fueled by months of accumulated grievances and the fear that her coronation would legitimize policies they found intolerable. The city that had seemed securely within her grasp suddenly became hostile territory, where her presence threatened violence that could destroy everything she had worked to achieve. Matilda's flight from London represented one of the most dramatic reversals in English royal history, as the woman who had seemed destined for coronation found herself driven from the capital by the very subjects she sought to rule. The undignified retreat to Oxford, conducted under cover of darkness to avoid hostile crowds, transformed triumphant queen into fugitive claimant in the space of a few terrifying hours. The psychological impact of this humiliation would resonate throughout the remainder of her campaign. The immediate aftermath of the London debacle saw Stephen's supporters rallying with renewed vigor around his wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, who had maintained her husband's cause during his captivity. Her success in organizing resistance while the Empress controlled the capital demonstrated the crucial importance of maintaining momentum in medieval political conflicts. The window of opportunity that had opened with Stephen's capture was rapidly closing as his enemies recovered their confidence. The strategic consequences of Matilda's failure to secure coronation extended far beyond personal disappointment to fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority in medieval England. Her inability to manage London's political dynamics suggested serious limitations in her understanding of English governance, while her flight from the capital provided powerful propaganda for those who argued that God had withdrawn his favor from her cause. The summer of 1141 witnessed the rapid erosion of advantages that had seemed insurmountable just months earlier. Castles that had surrendered after Lincoln began to reconsider their allegiances as reports spread of the Empress's difficulties and Queen Matilda's successful organization of resistance. The momentum that had carried Matilda from Arundel to the gates of Westminster now reversed itself with equal speed, transforming certain victory into uncertain struggle. Winchester, which had provided the ecclesiastical sanction for Matilda's claims, became the focal point of renewed conflict as both sides sought to control the ancient capital of Wessex. The city's religious significance made it crucial to any claimant's legitimacy, while its strategic location controlled communications between London and the West Country strongholds that remained loyal to the Empress. The battle for Winchester would determine whether Matilda could recover from her London humiliation or whether Stephen's cause would experience a complete resurrection. The siege that developed around Winchester in the late summer of 1141 represented the last chance for either side to achieve decisive victory through conventional military means. Queen Matilda's forces, reinvigorated by their success in expelling the Empress from London, sought to capture or kill their rival and end the succession crisis through the simple expedient of eliminating the claimant. For the Empress, holding Winchester meant maintaining her challenge to Stephen's legitimacy and preserving the possibility of future success. The rout of Winchester on September 14, 1141, completed the reversal of fortunes that had begun with Matilda's flight from London. Robert of Gloucester's capture, while covering his sister's retreat, eliminated her most capable military commander and forced her into the agonizing decision of whether to exchange Stephen for her half-brother, the man whose generalship had won the Battle of Lincoln. Now found himself a prisoner, whose freedom would require returning the crown's greatest enemy to liberty and power. The wheel of fortune had completed another revolution, transforming hunters into hunted and victors into supplicants for mercy they could not expect to receive. As autumn winds stripped the leaves from English oak trees, Matilda found herself contemplating a future that bore little resemblance to the glorious destiny that had seemed within her grasp just months before. The woman who had almost worn England's crown now faced the prospect of indefinite exile or continued warfare against opponents whose confidence had been restored by their recent successes. The stage was set for the next phase of a conflict that would consume England for more than a decade, transforming prosperity into chaos and demonstrating that the price of royal ambition could be measured in the suffering of entire kingdoms. The winter of 1142 descended upon England like a shroud of ice and despair, coating the realm in frost that seemed to mirror the frozen hearts of those locked in civil war. In the ancient stones of Oxford Castle, where Roman foundations met Norman ambition, Empress Matilda found herself trapped not merely by Stephen's siege engines, but by the relentless march of time itself. The castle that had once seemed impregnable now felt like a gilded cage, its walls closing in with each passing day as provisions dwindled and hope grew thin as winter air. Stephen's army had surrounded Oxford Castle with the methodical precision of a spider weaving its web each strand of the siege designed to cut off another avenue of escape or supply. The king had learned much from his previous encounters with his formidable cousin, and this time he was determined that Matilda would not slip through his fingers as she had done so often before. His forces numbered in the thousands, a forest of spears and banners that stretched across the frost-covered countryside around Oxford like a medieval constellation of war. Within the castle walls, Matilda faced a slow torture of a siege that had already lasted over 2 months. Food stores that had seemed adequate in autumn now appeared pitifully small as winter deepened, and the constant vigilance required by the threat of assault wore down both defender and commander alike. Yet those who observed the Empress during these dark days noted that her spirit remained unbroken, her voice steady in counsel, her presence a beacon of resolve that kept her followers' courage from failing entirely. The castle itself had become a microcosm of the larger conflict that had torn England apart for 7 years. Norman nobles who had sworn allegiance to Matilda found themselves questioning whether their loyalty was worth the price of starvation, while others drew inspiration from her unwavering determination to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. The daily routine of siege warfare, the watch schedules, the rationing of food, the constant preparation for assault had created a strange intimacy among the defenders, binding them together in shared hardship. Stephen himself had established his headquarters in the town below, close enough to oversee the siege personally, but far enough to avoid the occasional arrow or crossbow bolt fired from the castle walls. His presence lent weight to the operation, demonstrating to both his own forces and any potential relieving army that he was committed to seeing this siege through to its conclusion. The king had learned that half measures against Matilda led only to renewed conflict. This time, he intended to end her resistance once and for all. The decision to attempt escape was not made lightly. Matilda understood that failure would mean certain capture and the effective end of her cause, but she also recognized that surrender would achieve the same result with less honor. Her imperial training had taught her that bold action often succeeded where caution failed, and her years of civil war had shown her that audacity could overcome apparently insurmountable odds. The plan that emerged from her counsels was as desperate as it was daring. The night of December 14th, 1142, witnessed one of the most remarkable escapes in medieval history, an event that would be remembered and retold for centuries as evidence of both divine providence and human courage. As darkness fell over the snow-covered landscape around Oxford, Matilda prepared for a journey that would either secure her freedom or end her life. She had chosen to wear white garments that would blend with the snow, a practical decision that also carried symbolic weight. She would emerge from this trial either pure and victorious, or as a ghost of her former ambitions. Her companions for this desperate venture were carefully chosen, men whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of civil war and whose skills were suited to the dangerous task ahead. They would need to move silently through enemy lines, cross the frozen Thames without detection, and reach safety at Abingdon Abbey, some 6 miles distant. The abbey, under the protection of Robert of Gloucester's supporters, offered sanctuary, if they could reach it alive and undetected. The castle's defenders had spent days preparing for this moment, creating diversions and false alarms designed to mask the real escape attempt. As Matilda and her small party prepared to leave through a gate that faced away from the main siege lines, other parts of the castle garrison made noise and movement to draw attention elsewhere. The coordination required for such an operation demonstrated the loyalty Matilda still commanded even in her darkest hour. Leaving the castle proved to be only the beginning of their ordeal. The frozen countryside stretched before them like a vast white ocean, broken only by the dark lines of hedgerows and the occasional shadow of farm buildings. Stephen's forces had established watchposts and patrols throughout the area, and any sound or movement risked discovery and immediate pursuit. The little party moved with infinite care, their footsteps muffled by snow, but their hearts loud with fear and hope. The most dangerous moment came when they reached the frozen Thames. The river that had been England's great highway now presented both opportunity and mortal danger. The ice might support their weight, or it might crack beneath them, plunging them into water that would mean certain death in the winter cold. Matilda, who had crossed this same river many times in boats during better days, now faced it as a treacherous barrier between captivity and freedom as they stepped onto the ice. Each footfall seemed to echo across the frozen landscape like thunder, though in reality their passage was nearly silent. The ice held, thick enough to support their weight, but thin enough to groan ominously with each step. Behind them, Oxford Castle continued to show signs of activity, the defenders maintaining the illusion that Matilda was still within its walls. Ahead lay the uncertain promise of safety. If they could avoid detection for just a few more hours, the crossing of the Thames represented more than a physical journey. It was a symbolic passage from defeat to possibility, from the trap of Oxford to the hope of renewed resistance. As Matilda's feet touched the far bank, she had accomplished something that would become legendary, an escape so daring and unexpected that even her enemies would grudgingly admire its execution. But the night was far from over, and Abingdon Abbey still lay miles ahead through enemy territory. The final leg of their journey tested their endurance to its limits. 6 miles through snow-covered fields and frozen paths, avoiding roads where enemy patrols might be encountered, moving always in the shadows and silence of the winter night. Matilda, who had once travelled in imperial splendour through the cities of Germany and Italy, now found herself creeping through the English countryside like a fugitive, her royal dignity reduced to the simple necessity of survival. When the walls of Abingdon Abbey finally appeared through the pre-dawn gloom, they seemed like a vision from a dream. The abbey, dedicated to the Holy Cross, had been a centre of learning and sanctuary for centuries, its monks bound by sacred vows to offer protection to those who sought it. As Matilda and her companions stumbled through the abbey gates, exhausted but alive, they carried with them not only their own survival, but the continued possibility of their cause. The news of Matilda's escape reached Stephen the following morning, when his forces discovered that Oxford Castle's resistance had suddenly collapsed. The defenders, no longer bound to protect their lord, surrendered immediately, revealing that the prize Stephen had sought so desperately had slipped away in the night. The king's reaction was said to be a mixture of rage and grudging admiration of him. His enemies acknowledged that Matilda's escape had been a masterpiece of courage and planning. The months following, Matilda's escape from Oxford saw a curious reversal of fortunes that demonstrated how quickly the wheel of medieval politics could turn. While the Empress had secured her freedom, she had also lost her most important stronghold in central England, leaving her forces scattered and her position weaker than it had been since the early days of the Civil War. Stephen, despite missing his primary objective, had achieved a significant strategic victory by capturing Oxford Castle and demonstrating that even Matilda's most secure positions could be taken. The escape had also created a new dynamic in the conflict, where once both sides had fought with the expectation of decisive victory. The events at Oxford suggested that the war might continue indefinitely, with neither party able to deliver a knockout blow to the other. This realization began to wear on nobles who had initially supported one side or the other with enthusiasm. As the costs of civil war mounted and the benefits of peace became increasingly attractive, in the early months of 1143, both sides found themselves reassessing their strategies and capabilities. Matilda, safely ensconced in the West Country strongholds that remained loyal to her cause, began to focus more heavily on consolidating her existing territories rather than attempting new conquests. This shift reflected both the practical limitations imposed by her reduced circumstances and a growing awareness that time might be working in her favor if she could simply outlast Stephen's resolve. Stephen, meanwhile, found that his victory at Oxford had not translated into the decisive advantage he had hoped for. While he controlled more territory than ever before, the need to garrison his conquests stretched his forces thin and prevented him from achieving the concentrated blow that might have ended the civil war entirely. The kingdom remained divided, with large areas under the control of local lords who owed allegiance to neither claimant and governed their territories as independent kingdoms. The most significant development during this period was the growing prominence of Matilda's eldest son, Henry Plantagenet, who was approaching his 10th birthday and beginning to be seen as a potential alternative to both his mother and Stephen. Geoffrey of Anjou, now firmly in control of Normandy, began making discreet inquiries about the possibility of transferring Matilda's claim to her son, recognizing that a young male heir might attract support that the Empress herself could no longer command. This generational shift was accelerated by the gradual exhaustion of the original protagonists in the Civil War. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's most important supporter and half-brother, was aging and beginning to show signs of the strain that 7 years of constant warfare had placed upon him. Many of the original supporters of both sides had died in battle or from the diseases that followed armies, creating space for new voices to be heard in the councils of both factions. The Church, which had played such a crucial role in legitimizing Stephen's original claim to the throne, also began to show signs of war weariness. Bishops, who had once enthusiastically supported one side or the other, now focused increasingly on peace negotiations, recognizing that the ongoing conflict was devastating the very communities they were sworn to protect. The papal legate, Henry of Blois, Stephen's brother, found himself in the difficult position of trying to support his brother's kingship while also working toward a resolution that might require significant compromise. As 1143 progressed into 1144, the military situation began to stabilize into a pattern that would persist for several more years. Stephen controlled the southeast and much of the Midlands, including the crucial city of London, while Matilda dominated the West Country and maintained important strongholds in other parts of the kingdom. Neither side possessed the strength to dislodge the other from their core territories, creating a stalemate that was sustainable militarily but devastating economically and socially. The local impact of this prolonged conflict was becoming increasingly apparent to those who lived through it. Trade routes were disrupted, harvests were seized by competing armies, and the normal mechanisms of law and justice had broken down in many areas. Contemporary chroniclers began to describe England as a land where Christ and his saints slept, suggesting that divine protection had been withdrawn from a kingdom that could not resolve its internal divisions. Yet within this apparent chaos, new forms of governance were emerging that would have lasting impacts on English political development. Local lords who found themselves effectively independent of royal control began experimenting with new forms of administration and justice, creating precedents for baronial self-governance that would influence future constitutional developments. The necessity of governing without strong royal oversight forced innovations that might never have emerged in more peaceful times. By 1147, the character of the Civil War had fundamentally changed from the dynamic conflict of the early 1140s to something more resembling a chronic condition that England had learned to live with rather than resolve. Matilda herself, now in her mid-40s, began to recognize that her own direct claim to the throne was becoming less viable with each passing year. The energy and optimism that had sustained her through the early years of the conflict had given way to a more pragmatic assessment of what was possible and what was not. This recognition coincided with the growing maturity and capability of her son Henry, who at 14 was already demonstrating the intelligence and charisma that would make him one of medieval Europe's most successful rulers. Geoffrey of Anjou had been careful to provide Henry with an education that combined military training with diplomatic skill, preparing him for the complex challenges of governing the disparate territories that would eventually comprise the Empire. The decision to begin transferring leadership of Matilda's cause to her son was not made suddenly, but evolved gradually through a series of small steps and symbolic gestures. Henry began appearing more frequently at military councils and diplomatic negotiations, his presence serving to remind supporters that Matilda's cause offered not just restoration of past claims, but the promise of future stability under young and vigorous leadership. This transition was facilitated by the death of several key figures who had shaped the early years of the conflict. Robert of Gloucester died in 1147, removing Matilda's most important military commander and political advisor. His death marked the end of an era, as he had been one of the few remaining figures who could remember the reign of Henry I and command personal loyalty from nobles who had served the old king. The loss of Robert forced Matilda to rely more heavily on a new generation of supporters, many of whom saw their primary loyalty as being to Henry rather than to his mother. This shift was not necessarily unwelcome to Matilda, who had always understood that her ultimate goal was not personal glorification but the establishment of her dynasty on the English throne. If that goal could be better achieved through her son's leadership than her own, she was prepared to make the necessary adjustments. Henry's first independent military expedition to England in 1147 was carefully orchestrated to test both his capabilities and the response of potential supporters. Though the campaign achieved only limited military success, it demonstrated that the young prince could command loyalty and conduct himself credibly in the dangerous arena of English politics. More importantly, it showed that he was prepared to take personal risks for his inheritance rather than simply waiting for others to secure it for him. The gradual transfer of leadership also reflected changing attitudes among the English nobility toward the conflict itself. Many barons who had initially supported Matilda out of loyalty to Henry now found themselves more interested in the practical question of who could provide stable governance than in the legal niceties of succession law. Henry's youth and energy suggested that he might be better positioned to heal the divisions that had torn the kingdom apart for over a decade. Stephen, now in his 50s, and visibly aging under the strain of constant warfare, also began to show less enthusiasm for continuing a conflict that had consumed most of his adult life. His own heir, Eustace, lacked his father's charisma and had made himself unpopular with many of Stephen's supporters through his harsh treatment of church properties. The contrast between the promising young Henry and the problematic Eustace began to influence calculations about the kingdom's future. As 1148 approached, Matilda made the momentous decision to return to Normandy, leaving the English phase of her campaign in the hands of her supporters while she focused on consolidating her family's continental possessions. This decision was presented as a temporary withdrawal, but many understood it to represent the effective end of her personal bid for the English crown. She would remain a power behind the scenes, but the active leadership of her cause would pass to the next generation. The return to Normandy also allowed Matilda to work more closely with Geoffrey of Anjou, whose conquest of the duchy had provided the territorial base necessary for any eventual recovery of the English crown. The combined resources of Normandy and Anjou created a power base that was potentially stronger than anything Stephen could marshal, particularly if it could be effectively coordinated with continued resistance in England itself. Before departing England, Matilda took care to establish the institutional framework that would allow her supporters to continue functioning effectively in her absence. Key strongholds were placed under reliable commanders, financial arrangements were made to ensure continued funding for military operations, and diplomatic channels were established to maintain communication between the continental and English branches of her party. Her last major act as active leader of the English campaign was to formally present Henry to her supporters as her chosen successor in the struggle for the crown. This ceremony, held at one of her western strongholds, served both to legitimize the transition of leadership and to demonstrate that the cause would continue, even without her direct involvement. The young prince's acceptance by the assembled nobles marked a turning point that would ultimately lead to the resolution of the Civil War. As Matilda's ship departed English shores for what many suspected would be the last time, she carried with her the knowledge that while she had not achieved her immediate goal of ruling England in her own right, she had preserved her dynasty's claim to the throne and positioned her son to succeed where she had not. The Civil War would continue, but its character would be fundamentally different, shaped now by the promise of future resolution rather than the bitter memories of past grievances. The England she left behind was scarred by over a decade of civil war, but also transformed in ways that would have lasting significance. The conflict had demonstrated both the strength and limitations of royal authority, had forced innovations in local governance and military organization, and had created precedents for baronial resistance to royal power that would influence English constitutional development for centuries to come. Matilda's struggle, even in its apparent failure, had changed the kingdom irreversibly in Normandy. She would find a different kind of satisfaction as her husband. Geoffrey's conquest of the duchy was consolidated, and her son Henry was prepared for the greater challenges that lay ahead. The imperial crown she had once worn seemed distant now, but the prospect of her dynasty ruling both England and the continental possessions that would become the Angevin Empire offered compensation for personal disappointment. The stage was being set for the final act of a drama that had begun with her father's death 13 years earlier, and Matilda would play her part from the shadows while her son stepped into the light of history. The year 1148 brought with it the recognition that England had become a battlefield too costly to maintain indefinitely. Matilda, now 46 years old and bearing the accumulated weariness of nearly a decade of civil war, made the decision that would define the final phase of her remarkable life. She would return to Normandy, leaving the continuation of her cause in the capable hands of her eldest son, Henry Plantagenet, who at 15 already displayed the political acumen and military courage that would make him one of England's greatest kings. The journey across the Channel that took her away from English shores for the final time was heavy with symbolism. Behind her lay a kingdom torn by civil war, its abbeys burnt, its fields untended, its people exhausted by the endless cycle of siege and counter-siege that had characterized the Anarchy. Yet she departed not in defeat, but with the quiet confidence of someone who understood that victory sometimes required patience, that dynasties were built across generations rather than single lifetimes. Normandy welcomed back its former duchess with a mixture of relief and anticipation. Geoffrey's successful conquest of the duchy had established firm Angevin control, but Matilda's return brought something that military victory alone could not provide: the wisdom of someone who had governed the Holy Roman Empire, who had negotiated with popes and emperors, who had learned the arts of statecraft in the most sophisticated courts of Europe. She established her court near Rouen, in the same region where she had been born to imperial destiny for decades earlier. The choice was deliberate, connecting her not only to her Norman heritage, but to the continuity of legitimate rule that she represented. From this base, she would spend the remaining years of her life not in retirement, but in active governance, serving as regent when her son's expanding domains required his presence elsewhere. The relationship between mother and son during these years revealed the depth of Matilda's political wisdom. Rather than attempting to control Henry's actions or claim credit for his successes, she provided counsel when asked and support when needed, but always allowed him to establish his own authority. This careful balance between guidance and independence would prove crucial as Henry began the systematic campaign that would eventually secure his inheritance. Her correspondence during this period, though fragmentary, reveals a mind still sharp and engaged with the great political questions of her time. She maintained relationships with major figures across Europe, using her network of contacts to support Henry's growing reputation and to ensure that his eventual claim to the English throne would receive international recognition. The imperial title she had insisted on maintaining throughout her life now served a new purpose, elevating her son's status by association. The administrative records from her Norman regency demonstrate that her years of struggle had not diminished her capacity for effective governance. She oversaw legal reforms, managed ecclesiastical appointments, and maintained the delicate balance between ducal authority and local autonomy that characterized successful Norman rule. Her approach combined the institutional knowledge gained during her imperial years with the practical experience of 9 years of civil war. Meanwhile, in England, the stalemate that had characterized the later years of the Anarchy was gradually shifting in Henry's favor. His military campaigns, conducted with a sophistication that belied his youth, succeeded in expanding the territories under Angevin control, while avoiding the costly sieges that had exhausted both sides during the previous decade. More importantly, his diplomatic initiatives began to attract nobles who had grown weary of seemingly endless conflict. Matilda's influence on these developments was subtle but significant. Her letters of introduction opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Her diplomatic connections provided intelligence about Stephen's weaknesses, and her counsel helped Henry avoid the mistakes that had cost her the crown during her own campaign. The student had surpassed the teacher, but the foundation of his success lay in lessons learned during years of exile and struggle, the death of Stephen's eldest son, Eustace, in August 1153, fundamentally altered the political landscape. Without a clear heir who commanded widespread support, Stephen's position became increasingly untenable. The nobles who had supported him out of loyalty or convenience began to reconsider their allegiances, recognizing that the Angevin cause now offered the prospect of stable succession that Stephen's dynasty could no longer guarantee. From Normandy, Matilda watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see vindication of her life's work. The boy she had borne at Le Mans 20 years earlier was now positioned to claim the throne that had been denied to her, not through conquest alone, but through the recognition that legitimate succession served England's interests better than continued civil war. The negotiations that culminated in the Treaty of Wallingford represented more than the end of a civil war. They marked the triumph of a principle that Matilda had defended throughout her life, that legitimate succession, based on hereditary right and formal recognition, provided the foundation for stable monarchy. The treaty, signed in November 1153, acknowledged Henry Plantagenet as Stephen's heir, effectively validating the claim that Matilda had pressed for nearly 2 decades. The terms of the agreement reflected the political realities that had emerged from 19 years of conflict. Stephen would retain the crown for his lifetime, ensuring that his dignity and that of his supporters would be preserved, but Henry would be recognized as his designated successor, inheriting not only England but the legitimate authority that came with formal recognition by the existing monarch. It was a compromise that saved face for all parties while establishing the foundation for future stability for Matilda. Receiving news of the treaty at her Norman court, the agreement represented both personal vindication and political wisdom. The woman who had once been driven from Westminster Abbey by hostile crowds now saw her son accepted as rightful heir to the throne she had claimed. The methods had changed, but the essential principle remained the same: hereditary right, properly established and formally recognized, formed the basis of legitimate monarchy. Stephen's death on October 25, 1154, brought the Civil War to its final conclusion. Henry Plantagenet, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, crossed the Channel to claim his inheritance as Henry II of England. His coronation at Westminster Abbey on December 19, 1154, marked not only the beginning of a new reign, but the establishment of the Angevin dynasty that would rule England. For the next 3 centuries, the young king who received the crown that his mother had been denied brought to the throne qualities that reflected both his Angevin heritage and the lessons learned during years of struggle. He possessed his grandfather Henry I's administrative genius, his father Geoffrey's military skill, and his mother's political acumen. More importantly, he understood that effective monarchy required not just the assertion of authority but its acceptance by those being governed. Matilda's influence on her son's early reign was both direct and indirect. Her experience in imperial governance provided valuable counsel on administrative matters, while her network of European contacts helped establish the international relationships that would characterize Henry's expanding empire. The Angevin Empire that emerged under Henry II owed its foundations to the diplomatic and political groundwork that Matilda had laid during decades of struggle. The consolidation of Henry's authority proceeded with remarkable speed. The castle building that had characterized the anarchy was systematically reversed, with unauthorized fortifications demolished and royal control reasserted over the military infrastructure that had enabled local independence. The administrative system that had collapsed during the Civil War was rebuilt, often using officials who had gained experience in Matilda's service during her years as rival claimant. Church relations, which had been complicated by the competing claims of the Civil War period, were carefully managed to ensure both ecclesiastical support and royal authority. Henry's approach reflected lessons learned from his mother's experience with both imperial and papal politics, balancing respect for church privileges with assertion of royal prerogatives. The result was a settlement that avoided the conflicts that had plagued earlier reigns. From her Norman court, Matilda watched these developments with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see her life's work validated. The principles for which she had fought, legitimate succession, effective governance, and international recognition, were now embodied in a monarchy that commanded respect across Europe. Her struggle had not been in vain. It had been preparation for triumph achieved through different means. The speed with which Henry consolidated his authority demonstrated that England was ready for strong, stable government after nearly 2 decades of civil conflict. The nobles who had fought on both sides during the Anarchy rallied to support a king who offered both legitimacy and competence. The church hierarchy, exhausted by the complications of divided loyalties, welcomed a monarch who could provide both protection and proper governance. Trade and commerce, which had suffered during the years of political uncertainty, began to recover, as Henry's government provided the security and stable currency that merchants required. The legal system, which had fragmented into competing jurisdictions during the Civil War, was systematically reformed to ensure consistent justice across the realm. The foundations were being laid for the constitutional and legal developments that would characterize the later 12th century. International relations also reflected the transformation that Henry's accession had brought about. The Angevin Empire that emerged during the 1150s stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, making its ruler one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. This expansion required sophisticated diplomatic management, drawing on the experience and connections that Matilda had developed during her imperial years. The years following Henry II's coronation revealed a new dimension of Matilda's remarkable career. Her role as the power behind the throne, the experienced counselor whose advice shaped one of the most successful reigns in English history. Now in her 50s, she possessed a unique combination of imperial experience, administrative expertise, and hard-won political wisdom that made her an invaluable advisor to her son during the crucial early years of his reign. Her influence was most evident in the careful management of international relations that characterized Henry's expanding empire. The diplomatic skills she had learned during her years as Holy Roman Empress proved invaluable as Henry navigated the complex web of alliances and enmities that connected the various components of his vast domains. Her correspondence with major European figures provided intelligence and opened channels for negotiation that might otherwise have remained closed. The administrative reforms that transformed England during the 1150s and 1160s also bore the mark of Matilda's influence. Her experience with imperial governance provided models for the bureaucratic innovations that Henry introduced, while her understanding of the relationship between central authority and local administration helped shape the balance between royal control and regional autonomy that characterized successful medieval governance. Perhaps most significantly, Matilda's counsel proved crucial during the early stages of what would become known as the Becket controversy. Her experience with the complex relationship between secular and ecclesiastical authority, gained during her years in the Holy Roman Empire, provided valuable perspective on the challenges that Henry faced in dealing with Archbishop Thomas Becket's assertions of church independence. The letters and chronicles that survive from this period reveal a woman whose political acumen had been sharpened rather than diminished by decades of struggle. Her advice to Henry reflected not only immediate, tactical considerations, but long-term strategic, thinking about the foundations of royal authority and the preservation of dynastic legitimacy. She understood that successful monarchy required not just the assertion of power, but its careful cultivation and protection. Her role in managing the succession question for the next generation demonstrated the forward-thinking approach that had characterized her entire career. The provisions made for her grandsons, the future kings Richard I and John, reflected lessons learned from the succession crisis that had followed her father's death. Clear designation of heirs, formal recognition by appropriate authorities, and careful preparation for eventual transition became hallmarks of Angevin succession planning. The relationship between Matilda and her daughter-in-law, Eleanor of Aquitaine, revealed another dimension of her political sophistication. Eleanor brought to the Angevin court not only vast territorial holdings, but also a cultural sophistication and political network that complemented Matilda's imperial connections. The two remarkable women, despite their different backgrounds and temperaments, worked together to provide the diplomatic and cultural foundation for Henry's expanding empire. Religious patronage continued to play an important role in Matilda's later years as she founded and supported Cistercian monasteries throughout Normandy. These foundations served multiple purposes. They demonstrated royal piety, provided centers for prayer and scholarship, and created networks of support for the Angevin dynasty. Her particular devotion to the Cistercian order reflected both personal conviction and political calculation. The legal reforms that became one of the defining characteristics of Henry II's reign also reflected Matilda's influence. Her experience with different legal systems, Norman, English, and imperial, provided valuable perspective on the development of common law procedures that would become the foundation of English jurisprudence. The balance between royal authority and legal consistency that characterized these reforms bore the mark of her counsel. Economic policy during the early years of Henry's reign similarly reflected the lessons that Matilda had learned during her years of struggle. The importance of secure taxation, stable currency, and protection for trade had been driven home. During the Civil War years, when the breakdown of government had devastated commerce, the economic recovery that characterized the 1150s and 1160s built on principles that Matilda had advocated throughout her political career. Her continuing correspondence with major European figures also served Henry's diplomatic interests. The connections she had maintained with German, French, and Italian courts provided valuable intelligence about potential threats and opportunities. Her letters often served as unofficial diplomatic communications, allowing Henry's government to explore possibilities and gauge reactions without formal commitment. The cultural development that flourished during Henry's reign also bore the mark of Matilda's influence. Her imperial experience had exposed her to the sophisticated court cultures of Germany and Italy, providing models for the literary and artistic patronage that became characteristic of the Angevin court. The flowering of vernacular literature, historical writing, and architectural innovation that marked the later 12th century built on foundations that she had helped establish. The conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket that dominated the 1160s provided the ultimate test of Matilda's political wisdom and diplomatic skill. Her unique experience with the complex relationship between secular and religious authority, gained during her years as Holy Roman Empress, made her one of the few people capable of understanding both the theological and political dimensions of the controversy that threatened to undermine everything Henry had achieved. The roots of the conflict lay in Henry's attempt to assert royal authority over ecclesiastical matters, particularly the question of whether clergy accused of crimes should be tried in church courts or royal courts. For Henry, this was a matter of ensuring that royal justice applied to all subjects regardless of their religious status. For Becket, it represented an unacceptable infringement on the ancient privileges of the Church. Matilda's counsel during this crisis reflected the depth of her understanding of medieval political theology. Her experience with the investiture controversy during her imperial years had taught her that conflicts between church and state could threaten the foundations of royal authority if not carefully managed. She understood that while kings might possess the power to coerce church leaders, the spiritual authority of the church could not be conquered by force alone. Her attempts at mediation during the early stages of the conflict demonstrated both her diplomatic skill and her understanding of the personalities involved. She had known Becket during his years as Chancellor, when his administrative abilities had made him one of Henry's most valued advisers. The transformation of the pragmatic Chancellor into the uncompromising Archbishop represented a puzzle that she was uniquely positioned to understand. The letters that survive from this period reveal Matilda's careful approach to the crisis. Rather than simply supporting her son's position, she sought to find middle ground that would preserve both royal authority and ecclesiastical dignity. Her proposals reflected the kind of sophisticated political thinking that had characterized her entire career, seeking solutions that addressed underlying principles rather than immediate advantages. Her correspondence with church leaders across Europe demonstrated her understanding that the Becket controversy had implications far beyond England. The precedent that Henry was trying to establish would affect church-state relations throughout Christendom, making it essential to maintain the support of moderate church leaders who understood the need for balance between competing authorities. The exile of Becket to France in 1164 created new diplomatic challenges that required all of Matilda's skill to manage. The Archbishop's presence at the French court provided Henry's enemies with a powerful weapon, while his continued assertion of ecclesiastical privileges threatened to undermine royal authority even from a distance. Matilda's efforts to maintain communication with Becket while supporting her son's position required extraordinary diplomatic finesse. Her role in the negotiations that eventually brought Becket back to England in 1170 demonstrated both her persistence and her understanding of the limits of political compromise. The agreement that was reached satisfied neither party completely, but it provided a framework for coexistence that might have resolved the crisis if not for the personal animosities that developed during 6 years of conflict. The murder of Becket in Canterbury Cathedral on December 29, 1170, represented a catastrophic failure of the careful diplomacy that Matilda had advocated throughout the crisis. While Henry's responsibility for the assassination remained ambiguous, he had certainly never ordered it. Explicitly, the political consequences were immediate and severe. The king, who had seemed on the verge of establishing unprecedented royal authority, suddenly found himself facing potential excommunication and the collapse of everything he had achieved. Matilda's counsel during the aftermath of Becket's murder proved crucial to Henry's survival. Her experience with papal politics provided valuable guidance on the process of reconciliation with the Church, while her understanding of European diplomatic networks helped manage the international crisis that the assassination had created. The penance that Henry eventually performed at Becket's tomb bore the mark of her advice, sufficient to demonstrate genuine contrition without undermining royal dignity. The long-term consequences of the Becket crisis reinforced lessons that Matilda had been advocating throughout her son's reign. The limits of royal authority, the importance of maintaining church support, and the dangers of allowing personal conflicts to escalate into political crises all became evident. During the aftermath of the Archbishop's death, the constitutional settlement that eventually emerged reflected principles that she had long advocated. Her role in managing the crisis also demonstrated the continuing value of her imperial experience. The solutions that were eventually adopted borrowed heavily from the precedents established during the investiture controversy, particularly the careful separation of temporal and spiritual authorities that had been worked out in the Holy Roman Empire during the early 12th century. The restoration of Henry's reputation after the Becket crisis required years of careful diplomacy, much of it guided by Matilda's counsel. Her understanding of how to rebuild relationships damaged by political conflict proved invaluable as Henry worked to restore his standing with both church leaders and fellow monarchs. The process demonstrated once again the value of the long-term perspective that had characterized her entire political career. As the 1160s progressed, Matilda's role gradually shifted from active advisor to respected elder stateswoman, though her influence on the Angevin court remained significant until the end of her life. The woman who had once commanded armies and negotiated with emperors now found satisfaction in watching her son establish the kind of stable, effective monarchy that she had always envisioned. The principles for which she had fought were now embodied in institutions that would outlive any individual ruler. Her religious devotion, which had been a constant throughout her tumultuous life, became more pronounced during these final years. The foundations she established and the monasteries she supported reflected not only personal piety, but a desire to ensure that prayers would be offered for her soul and for the continued success of the dynasty she had helped establish. The Cistercian houses that benefited from her patronage would remember her name long after the details of her political struggles had been forgotten. The administrative skills that had served her throughout her career found new expression in the management of her Norman estates. The duchy that Geoffrey had conquered and Henry had inherited required constant attention to maintain the balance between ducal authority and local autonomy that characterized successful Norman rule. Matilda's oversight of these responsibilities during Henry's frequent absences demonstrated that her capacity for effective governance had not diminished with age. Her relationship with her younger sons, Geoffrey and William, revealed different aspects of her maternal wisdom. While Henry had been groomed for kingship from an early age, his brothers required different guidance as they found their places within the expanding Angevin system. Geoffrey's eventual role as Count of Nantes and William's position as a trusted administrator reflected careful planning about how to utilize the talents available within the dynasty. The grandchildren who began to arrive during the 1160s provided new sources of joy and concern for the aging empress. The future kings, Richard and John, along with their sisters, represented the next generation of Angevin rulers, and Matilda took an active interest in their education and preparation for the responsibilities they would eventually inherit. Her influence on their upbringing reflected lessons learned from decades of political experience. International recognition of her status continued to flow from European courts throughout these final years. The letters and gifts she received from German emperors, French kings, and Italian princes demonstrated that her imperial title retained its significance long after she had ceased to exercise direct political power. This recognition served not only her personal dignity but the broader diplomatic interests of the Angevin Empire. Her health began to decline gradually during the late 1160s, though she maintained her interest in political affairs until the end. The court physicians who attended her during her final illness found in her a patient who faced death with the same courage that had characterized her approach to life. She had lived to see her cause vindicated, her dynasty established, and her principles embodied in institutions that promised lasting stability. The preparations for her death reflected both personal preference and political calculation. Her choice to be buried at Bec Abbey rather than Rouen Cathedral demonstrated her preference for the monastery where she had found spiritual comfort during turbulent times, but it also ensured that her tomb would be in a location where prayers for her soul would be regularly offered by monks who understood the value of royal patronage. September 10th, 1167, brought the end of one of the most remarkable lives in medieval history. Matilda died at Rouen, surrounded by the ecclesiastical and secular officials who had served her during her final years. Her death marked not only the passing of an individual, but the end of an era that had seen the transformation of England from a kingdom torn by civil war into the center of a European empire. The funeral arrangements reflected both her personal wishes and the dignity appropriate to someone of her status. The procession to Bec Abbey attracted mourners from across Normandy and beyond, including representatives from courts throughout Europe, who came to pay their respects to a woman whose influence had extended far beyond the borders of any single kingdom. The epitaph carved on her tomb captured the essence of her remarkable life: great by birth, greater by marriage, greatest in her offspring. Here lies Matilda, the daughter, wife, and mother of Henry. These words, which became famous throughout medieval Europe, summarized a life that had touched the highest levels of power in multiple kingdoms and had helped shape the course of European history. Yet even death could not contain the influence of her extraordinary life. The institutions she had helped establish, the principles she had defended, and the dynasty she had founded continued to shape English and European development for centuries to come. The legal reforms of Henry II, the constitutional developments of the later 12th century, and the literary flowering that characterized the Angevin court all bore the mark of her influence. The historical assessment of her legacy would evolve over the centuries, but certain themes remained constant. Her courage in claiming rights that society was reluctant to grant to women, her skill in navigating the complex political currents of medieval Europe, and her success in establishing a dynasty that would rule England for 300 years. These achievements ensured that her name would be remembered long after the details of her struggles had been forgotten. In the abbeys and cathedrals where chronicles were written, scribes recorded her story as one of the defining episodes of the 12th century. Her struggle for the English throne became emblematic of the larger transformations that were reshaping medieval society: the evolution of legal institutions, the development of administrative systems, and the gradual emergence of what historians would later recognize as the foundations of modern government. The political principles that she had championed legitimate succession, effective governance, and the balance between royal authority and noble independence became fundamental elements of English constitutional development. The precedents established during her struggle with Stephen influenced legal thinking for generations, while the administrative innovations of Henry II's reign built on foundations that she had helped establish. But perhaps most significantly, her life demonstrated that the traditional limitations placed on women's political participation could be challenged and, under the right circumstances, overcome. The example she set inspired later generations of royal women who sought to exercise power in their own right, while the institutional changes that resulted from her struggle created new opportunities for female influence in medieval politics. In the end, what remains of Empress Matilda is not the sound of clashing swords or the fury of political debate, but something quieter and more enduring. Her legacy lives in the constitutional traditions that grew from her struggle, in the legal institutions that bear the mark of her influence, and in the simple but revolutionary idea that legitimate authority, once established, must be respected regardless of the gender of its holder. The abbey where she chose to rest has long since crumbled, its stones scattered by time and the ambitions of later ages. The crown she claimed was eventually placed on her son's head, and through him passed 2 generations of kings who ruled the realm she had fought to claim. The empire she helped establish stretched across continents and centuries, reaching heights of power and influence that even her imperial imagination could hardly have envisioned. Yet in the silence of historical memory, where the echoes of great deeds settle into wisdom, her true monument endures. It is written not in stone or gold, but in the understanding that courage, properly applied, can reshape the world. That a woman born into a society that denied her rights could, through force of will and clarity of purpose, establish principles that would outlive kingdoms. The winds that blow across the Norman landscape where she spent her final years still carry whispers of her name, not as empress or would-be queen, but as the woman who stood at the turning point of an age and chose to fight for tomorrow rather than accept the limitations of today. In that choice, and in the consequences that flowed from it, we find the measure of a life that changed the course of history itself. Her story ends not with triumph or defeat, but with transformation of herself, of the institutions she touched, and of the very possibilities available to those who would come after. In the quiet of autumn evenings, when the light fades over ancient stones and the past seems almost within reach, her legacy whispers still that legitimacy must be earned, that authority must serve justice, and that the courage to claim one's rights, whatever the cost, remains the foundation upon which all true progress rests.